Hello and welcome to CXO Bytes, a podcast brought to you by the Green Software Foundation and dedicated to supporting chiefs of information, technology, sustainability, and AI as they aim to shape a sustainable future through clean software. We will uncover the strategies and a big green move that's helped drive results for business and for the planet. I am your host, Sanjay Podder. Welcome to another episode of CXO Bytes, where we bring you unique insights into the world of sustainable software development. I am your host, Sanjay Podder. Today, we are excited to bring you highlights from a captivating panel discussion at the recent AWS Summit in Washington, held in June 2024. The AI-ready infrastructure panel featured industry heavyweights including Prasad Kalyanaraman, VP of Infrastructure Services at AWS, David Isaacs from the Semiconductor Industry Association, and renowned researcher Neil Thompson from MIT, and it was chaired by Axios senior business reporter Hope King. During this panel, we take a look at the transformative potential of generative AI, the global race for semiconductor innovation, and the significance of the CHIPS Act in strengthening supply chain resilience. Together, we will hopefully have a better picture of the future of AI infrastructure and the innovations driving this field forward. And before we dive in here, a reminder that everything we talk about will be linked in the show notes below this episode. So without further ado, let's dive into the AI-ready infrastructure panel from the AWS Summit.
Well, first, the avoidance of doubt, generative AI is an extremely transformative technology for us. Sometimes I liken it to the internet, right? The internet revolution. So I think we're very early in that journey. I would say that at least the way we've thought about generative AI, we think about it in three layers of the stack, right? The underlying infrastructure layer is one of them, and I'll get into more details there. And then there is the frameworks. We build a set of capabilities that makes it easy to run generative AI models. And then the third layer is the application layer, which is where many people are familiar with, like chat applications and so on. That's the third layer of the stack, right? Digging into the infrastructure layer, it always starts from obviously finding land and pouring concrete and building data centers out of it. And then on top of it, there's a lot more that goes inside a data center in terms of the networks that you build, in terms of how you think about electrical systems that are designed for it, how you land a set of servers, what kind of servers do you land. It's not just the GPUs that many people are familiar with, because you need a lot more in terms of storage, in terms of network, in terms of other compute capability. And then you have to actually cluster these servers together, because it's not a single cluster that does these training models. You can broadly think about generative AI as like training versus inference, and they both require slightly different infrastructure.
Okay, so talk about the generative, what that needs first, and then the inference.
Yeah, so the training models are typically large models that have, you might have heard the term number of parameters, and typically think of them as, and there are billions of parameters. So you take the content which is actually available out there on the internet, and then the models start learning about them. And once they start learning about them, then they start associating weights with different parts of that content that's there. And so when you ask the generative AI models for completing the set of tasks, that's the part which is inference. So you first create the model, which requires large clusters to be built, and then you have a set of capabilities that allows you to do inference on these models. So outcome of the model training exercise is a model with a different set of parameters and weights. And then inference workloads require these models, and then you merge that with your own customer data, so that customers can actually go and look at it to say, okay, what does this model produce for my particular use case?
Okay, let's go backwards to just even finding the land.
Yeah.
Where are the areas in the world where a company like Amazon AWS is first looking? Where are they? What are the areas that are most ideal to actually build data centers that will end up producing these models and training and all the applications on top of that?
So a lot of parameters that go into picking those locations. Well, first, we're a very customer-obsessed company, so our customers really tell us where they need the capacity. But land's one part of the equation. It's actually also about availability of green renewable power, which I'm sure we'll talk about through the course of this conversation. Being able to actually provide enough amounts of power and renewable sources to be able to run these compute capabilities is a fairly important consideration. Beyond that, there are regulations about like what kind of content that you can actually process. Then the availability of networks that allows you to connect these servers together, as well as connect them to users who are going to use those models. And finally, it's about the availability of hardware and chips that are capable of processing this. And I'd say that this is an area of pretty significant innovation over the last few years now. We've been investing in machine learning chips and machine learning for 12 years now. And so we have a lot of experience designing these servers. And so it takes network, land, power, regulations, renewable energy, and so on.
David, I want to bring you in here because, obviously the chips are a very important part of building the entity of AI and the brain and connecting that with the physical infrastructure. Where do you look geographically, or your body of organizations, when you're looking at maybe even diversifying the supply chain to build, even more chips as demand increases?
Yeah, so I think it's around the world, quite frankly, and many of you may be familiar with the CHIPS Act, passed 2 years ago here in the U.S., something very near and dear to my heart. That's resulting in incentivizing significant investment here in the U.S., and we think that's extremely important to make the supply chain more resilient overall, to help feed the demand that AI is bringing about. I would also add that the green energy that was just alluded to, that will also require substantial semiconductor innovation and new demand. So we think that improving our, the diversity of chip output, right now it's overly concentrated in ways that are subject to geopolitical tensions, natural disasters, other disruptions. We saw during the pandemic, the problems that can arise from the supply chain and the problems, I guess, most prominently illustrated in the automotive industry. We don't want that holding up the growth in AI. And so we think that having a more diversified supply chain, including a robust manufacturing presence here in the US, is what we're trying to achieve.
Is there any area of the world, though, that is safe from any of those risks? I mean, we're in the middle of a heat wave right now, right? And we're going to talk about cooling because it's an important part. But do you, just to be specific, see any parts of the world that are more ideal to set up these systems and these buildings, these data centers for resiliency going forward?
No, probably not. But just like, your investment portfolio, rule one is to diversify. I think we need a diversified supply chain for semiconductors. And, right now, the US and the world, for that matter, is reliant 92% on leading edge chips from the island of Taiwan and the remaining 8% from South Korea. You don't need to be a geopolitical genius or risk analyst to recognize that is dangerous and a problem waiting to happen. So as a result of the investments we're seeing under the CHIPS Act, we projected, and in a report we issued last month with Boston Consulting Group, that the U.S. will achieve 28% of leading edge chip production by 2032. That's, I think, good for the U.S. and good for the global economy.
All right, I'll ask this question one last time in a different way. Are there governments that are more proactive in reaching out to the industry to say, please come and build your plants here, data centers here?
I think there's sort of a global race to attract these investments. There's counterparts to the CHIPS Act being enacted in other countries. I think governments around the world view this as an industry of strategic importance, not just for AI, but for clean energy, for national defense, for telecom, for et cetera. And so there's a race for these investments. And, we're just glad to see that the U.S. is stepping up and implementing policy measures to attract some of these investments.
Sanjay, can you plug in any holes that maybe Prasad and David haven't mentioned in terms of looking just at the land and where are the most ideal areas around the world to build new infrastructure to support the growth of generative AI and other AI?
Well, I can only talk from the perspective of building data centers, which are, for example, greener, because as you know, AI, classical AI and now Gen AI, they consume a lot of energy, right? And based on what is the carbon intensity of the electricity used, it causes emission. So wearing my sustainability hat, I'm obviously concerned about energy, but I'm also concerned about carbon emission. So to me, probably a recent study, in fact, we did with AWS, points to the regional variability of what, for example, AWS has today in various parts of the world. So if you look at North America, that's US, Canada, EU, you will see that the data centers there, thanks to the cooler weathers, cold weather, the PUE, the power usage effectiveness, is much better, lower, right? Because you don't need a lot of energy to just cool the data centers, for example. Whereas you will see that in Asia Pac, for example, because of warmer conditions, you might need more power, not only to power your IT, but also to keep the data centers cooler, right? So purely from a geography perspective, you will see that there are areas of the world today where the carbon intensity of electricity is lower because the electricity is largely powered with renewable energy like Nordics. But at the same time, if you go to certain parts of the world, even today, a lot of the electricity is generated through fossil fuels, which means the carbon intensity is high. So purely from that perspective, if I see, some of the locations like EU, North America, Canada, even Brazil, for example, a lot of their grid has renewable energy. The PUE factors are more favorable. But having said that, I have seen, for example, governments in Singapore, they're creating new standards for how do you run data centers in tropical climates. They have, in fact, one of the interesting things that they have done is they have raised the temperature by 1 degree Celsius, the accepted level of temperature in the data center, because that translates to a lot of energy savings. So wearing my sustainability hat, if you ask me where should the data centers be, I would say they should be in locations where the carbon intensity of electricity is lower, so that we can keep the emissions low. That is very important. And obviously there are various other factors, because one needs to also remember that these data centers are not small. They take a lot of space. And where will this space come from? Hopefully they don't cause a trade-off with other sustainability areas like nature and biodiversity preservation. So the last thing I would like to see is, large pieces of forest making way to data centers, right? Hopefully good sense will prevail. Those things won't happen. But these are some of the factors one need to keep in mind. If you bring the sustainability dimension, how do I keep emissions lower? How do I make sure impact to water resources are less? One of the studies shows that 40 to 50 inferences translate to half a liter of water. So how do I make sure natural resources are less impacted? How do I make sure the forest and biodiversity are preserved? These are the things one has to think holistically when you select. And obviously other factors that Prasad will know, proximity to water supply, for cooling the centers. So it's a complex decision when you take to select a data center location.
I love the description and how detailed you went into. I mean, I think for all of us, looking at our jobs as members of the press, right? We want to know where the future is going, what it's going to look like. And from what I am putting together from what everyone has said so far, I'm thinking more data centers are going to be closer to the poles. They're cooler, in maybe more remote areas away from people, so that we're not draining resources from those communities. And Neil, I don't know if this is just, it's probably a personality thing, but like I sit there and I say to myself, I could ask ChatGPT, because I've been dabbling with it, to help me with maybe restructuring the sentence that I'm writing. Is it worth taking away water from a community? Is me asking the query of it worth all of the things that are powering it? I mean, these are things that I think about. I'm an avid composter. Like, this is my life, right? What are we ultimately doing, right? Like, is this, what are we all ultimately talking about when we now say AI is going to be a big part of our lives and it's going to be forever part of our lives? But then you're hearing, David and Sanjay and Prasad talk about everything that is required just to do that one thing to give me a grammar check.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, for sure, it is remarkable the sort of demand that AI can place on the resources that we need. And it's been a real change, right? You don't think of saying like, well, should I run Excel? Am I going to use a bunch of water from a community because I'm using Excel, right? You don't think about that. And but some of the calculations, there are things that you can do in Excel and you're like, oh, maybe I've put it on ChatGPT and I shouldn't. I should have put it on Excel or something like that. So yeah, so you absolutely have this larger appetite for resources that come in with AI. And the question is sort of, what do you do about that, right? And so, I mean, one of the nice things is, of course, that we don't have to put everything on a data center, right? People are working very hard to build models that are smaller so that it would live on your phone, right? And then you have, you still have the energy of recharging your phone, but it's not sort of disproportionate to training a model that is requiring tens of thousands of GPUs running for months. So I think that's one of the things that we can be thinking about here is the efficiency gains that we're going to get and how we can do that. And that's happening both at the chip level and also at the algorithmic level. And I'm happy to go into a lot more detail on that if folks would like. But I think that's the trade-off we have there is, okay, we're going to make these models more efficient. But the thing is, at the same time, there's this overwhelming trend that you see in AI, which is if you make your models bigger, they become more powerful. Right? And this is the race that all of the big folks, OpenAI, Anthropic, are all in, which is scaling up these models. And what you see is that scaling up does produce remarkable changes, right? Even the difference between, say, ChatGPT and GPT-4, if you look at its performance on things like the LSAT or other tests that it's doing, big jumps up as they scale up these models. So that's quite exciting, but it does come with all of these resource questions that we're having. Right? And so there's a real tension here.
Yeah, I would add that one of the things that's important for everyone to realize is that it is so critical to use responsible AI, right? And that
is me using that for grammar. Is that responsible use of AI? Is or not? I mean, I feel I should know.
AI. Yeah. What that means is that we have to be careful about how we use these resources, right? Because you asked a question about like how much water is it consuming when you use Excel or any other such application. The key is, this is the reason why when we looked at it and we said, look, we have a responsibility for the environment. We were actually the ones that actually came back and said, we need to get to net zero carbon by 2040 with the climate pledge 10 years ahead of the climate accord. And then we said we have to get to water positive. I'll give you a couple of anecdotes on this. So we will be returning more water to the communities than what we actually take on AWS by 2030. That's quite impressive if you actually think about it. And that is a capability that you can really innovate on if you try to think about how you use cooling and how you actually think about what you need to cool and so on. Right? The other day, I was actually reading another article in Dublin, in Ireland, where we actually used heat from a data center to help with community heating, right? And so district heating is another one. So I think there are lots of opportunities to innovate on this thing, to try and actually get the benefits of AI at the same time be responsible in terms of how we actually use it.
Let's talk more about the water. So how exactly is AWS going to return more water than it takes?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a few things there. One is, so just the technology allowing us to look at leaks that you have in our pipes, it's a pretty significant amount of water that gets leaked and gets wasted today. And we've done a lot of research in this area, trying to actually use some of our models, trying to use some of the technology that we built to go look for these leaks from municipalities when they actually transfer it. And that's one area. Renewable water sources is another area. So there's a lot of innovation that has happened already in trying to get to water positive. We took a pretty bold stand on getting to water positive because we have a high degree of confidence that this research will actually get us there.
Neil, how do you, is this the first time you're hearing about the water being returned? I mean, this sounds like an incredible development.
It is the first time I'm hearing, so without more details, I'm not sure I can say more about it specifically.
But is it? But it's almost like, you know, we need AI to solve these big problems. It's almost it's a quagmire. I mean, you have to use energy to save energy. Like that it's a paradox.
Sure. Well, so I guess let me say two things here. So one is to say that it is absolutely true that there are a bunch of costs that are associated with using AI. There are a bunch of benefits that come as well, right? And so we have this with almost all the technologies, right? When we produce, concrete roads and things like that, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that goes into that, but it also makes us more efficient and the like. And in some of the modeling that my lab has done and others have done, right, the upside of using AI in the economy and even more so in research and development to make new discoveries can have a huge benefit to the economy, right? And so the question is like, okay, if we can get that benefit, right, it may come with some costs, but then we need to think carefully about, well, what are we going to do to mitigate the fact that these costs exist and how can we deal with the things that they come in?
All of these things are racing at the same time, right? So you've got the race to build these models, to use it, to get the solutions, but then you got to build the thing at the same time, and then you got to find the chips. And I mean, like, obviously it's not my job. My job is to ask the questions. I don't understand how we can measure, like, what of these branches of this infrastructure is actually moving faster, and does one need to move faster than the other in order for everything to kind of follow along? I don't know if anybody.
Yeah, look, there's sometimes a misconception that these things started over the last 18 months. That's just not true.
Of course.
Right? Data centers have been there for a long period of time, trying to actually use, right now, if I talk about cloud computing, many of us are very familiar with that. Like 10 years back or a decade back, we were very early on that. So it's not something that is a change that has to happen overnight, right? It's something that has evolved over a long period of time. And so the investments that we've been doing over 15 years now are actually helping us do the next set of improvements that we have. So, we say this internally, there's no compression algorithm for experience. And so you have to have that experience, and you have to actually have spent time going all the way down to the chip level, to the hardware level, to the cooling level, to the network level. And then you start actually adding up all of these things. Then you start getting real large benefits.
So on that point, though, is it about building new or retrofitting old when it comes to, because I've seen reports that suggest that building new is more efficient in another way because, rack space or whatever. So just really quickly on that, I know Neil wants to jump in.
It's a combination. It's never a one size fits all. There's always
generally speaking, as you look at the development of AI.
I would say that there's obviously a lot of new capacity that's being brought online, but it's also about like efficiencies in existing capacity. Because when we design our data centers for like 20 plus years. But then hardware typically actually is useful about like 6 to 7 years or so. After that, you have to refresh them.
Right.
So you have an opportunity to go and refresh older data centers.
Yeah, it's not an over-the-air update. What were you going to say?
So you asked specifically about the race.
Yes.
I think that to me is one of the most interesting questions. It's something we spend a lot of time on. And it certainly is the case. There's been an enormous escalation. So since 2017, if you look at large language models, have been something like a 10x increase in the amount of compute being used to train them each year, right? So that's a giant increase. Compared to that, some of these other increases in efficiency have not kept pace. So if what you're talking about is the most cutting edge, the resources required are going up. But it's also the case that if you look at generally the diffusion of technology that's going on, right? Maybe some capacity already exists, but other firms want to be able to use it. That's just spreading out. Well, there you get to take advantage of the efficiency improvements that are going on. And for example, at the chip level, if you look in terms of the floating point operations that are done, the improvement is between 40 and 50% per year in terms of cost of flops per dollar. That's pretty rapid. But even that is actually not that rapid compared to efficiency improvements. So efficiency improvements, for those who sort of don't think about it in this way, think about it as like, I have some algorithm that I have to run on the chip. That's going to use a certain number of operations. And the question is, can I design something that achieves that same goal, just asking for fewer operations to do? Right? It's just a pure efficiency gain. And what we see is that in large language models, the efficiency is growing by 2 to 3x every year, which is huge, right? So if you think about the diffusion side of things, actually their efficiency gains are very, very high, and we should feel a little reassured that as that happens, the demands will drop.
But then you have to contend with the volume. Because, even if you reduce, even if you're making each more efficient, you're still multiplying it by other needs. So what does that offset in math, net?
Yeah, so, the question there is exactly how fast is AI growing?
Sure.
And that actually is a turns out to be a very deep question that people are struggling with. So, unfortunately, many of the early surveys that were done in this area were sort of what you might call a convenience sample, like you called people you cared about because they were your customers, but that was not representative of the whole country. So a couple of years ago, the census did some work, found out that there was about 6% of firms had actually been operationalizing AI, not that many.
Yeah.
Right? So we know that's going to be growing a lot, but exactly how fast, we're not sure. I think what we can say, though, is as that happens, we could have a moment where it's happening faster, but as long as these efficiency increases, continue over the longer term, and we do, so far we've seen them to be remarkably robust, that suggests that as that diffusion happens, then it will go down, so long as we don't all move to the biggest cutting edge model in order to do it.
David, I think you have probably some insight into how quickly the chip makers themselves are trying to design more efficient chips to this end.
Yeah, let me just start with the caveat that I'm not a technologist. I'm a scientist, but I'm a political scientist. But I'm glad that conversation has turned to innovation and efficiency gains, because some of the questions 10 minutes ago was assuming that the technology would remain the same, and that's not the case. Many people in the room are probably familiar with Moore's Law, and the improvements in computing power, the improvements in efficiency, and the reduced costs that have been happening for decades now. That innovation pathway is continuing. It's not necessarily the same in terms of scaling and more transistors on silicon, but it's advanced packaging, it's new designs, new architectures, and then there's the software and algorithm gains and the like. So we believe that will result in the efficiency gains and the resource savings. There's been a lot of third-party studies. We know for the semiconductor industry that the technologies we enable have a significant multiplier effect in reducing climate emissions, conserving resources, whether it's in transportation or energy generation or manufacturing. So we think there's a very substantial net gain from all these technologies. And I guess the other thing I would add is, the CHIPS Act, the formal name is the CHIPS and Science Act. And there's very substantial research investments, some of which have been appropriated and are getting up and running. Unfortunately, some of the science programs have been, and this is Washington speak, authorized, but not yet appropriated. We need to fund those programs so that this innovation trajectory can continue.
I mean, just by nature, we're the skeptics in the room, and we're looking at just the present day, and the imagination that is required for your jobs is one that's not easily accessible when a lot of us are concerned about the here and now. So I appreciate that context, David. Sanjay, I want to talk about what it is going to take, though, in terms of energy, right? That is something that will remain the same in terms of the needs. So what are you seeing in terms of how new data centers are being built, or even maybe systems, clusters of infrastructure that support these data centers that you're seeing emerging? And what is the sort of best solution as more companies are building and looking for land and to actually grow all these AI systems? Like what are the actual renewable sources of energy that are easy and sort of at hand right now to be built?
Well, I'm not an expert on that topic, so I won't be able to comment much on that. But I can talk about the fact that you were discussing on efficiencies. For the same energy, you can do a lot more with AI. What I mean by that is the way we build AI today, whether it's training or inferencing, there is a number of easy things to do, which has a huge impact in amount of energy you need for that AI. I think there was a reference to, for example, large Gen AI models. They are typically preferred because probably it gives more accuracy. But the reality is, in different business scenarios, you don't necessarily have to go to the largest of the models, right? And in fact, most of the LLM providers today are giving you LLMs of different t-shirt sizes, 7 billion parameters, 80 billion parameters. One of the intelligent thing to do is fit for purpose. You select a model which is good enough for your business use case. You don't necessarily go to the largest of the model, and the energy need is substantially lowered in the process, for example, right? And that to me are very practical levers. The other thing, for example, there was, I think Prasad referred to that these models, end of the day, they are deep learning models. There are techniques like quantizing, pruning, by which you can compress the models such that smaller models will likely take less energy, for example. And then, of course, inferencing. Traditionally, we have been always thinking about training with classical AI. But with generative AI, the game has changed. Because with Gen AI, given it's how pervasive and everybody is using it, millions of queries, the inferencing part takes more energy than training. Now, again, simple techniques can be used to lower that. Like you have one-shot inferencing. If you batch your prompts. Now, when you do these things, you come to your answers quicker. So, you don't have to go and query the large model again and again and again. So if you want to, design your trip itinerary to San Francisco, instead of, asking 15 prompts, you think about it. How do you batch it? This is my purpose. This is why I'm going. This many days I'll be there. And, it is very likely you'll get your itinerary in one shot. And in the process, a lot less energy will be used. So the point here is, and of course, data centers, right? All the chips that we are talking about, all these can, the custom silicons can lower the energy needs. So while I may not be able to comment on, what are the best sources of energy, because renewable energies are of various types, solar, wind, now people are talking about nuclear fusion and whatnot. But I'm saying even within the energy that we have, we can use it in a very sustainable way, in a very intelligent way, so that you get the business value you're seeking without wasting that energy unnecessarily.
It sounds like you want companies to be more mindful of their own data needs and not overshoot, but be more even efficient in how they're engineering what the applications can do for them.
Absolutely right. And on that point, about 70 to 80%, maybe more of the data is dark data. And what is dark data? These are data organizations they store with the hope that one day they will need it, and they never require them. So you are simply storing a lot of data, and these data also corresponds to energy needs, right? So there are a lot of rebound effect that you mentioned some time back, because the cost of compute went down, storage went down. The programming community became lazy programmers. So what happened as a result of that is, you are having all this, you're not bringing efficiency in the way you're doing software engineering. You are having all these virtual machines which you're hardly using, they're hardly utilized. They all require energy to operate. So there's a lot of housekeeping we can do, and that can lower energy in a very big way, energy needs, right? And then, because even if there's a lot of renewable energy, IT is not the only reason, or AI is not the only reason where the renewable energy should be used. There are other human endeavors. So we have to change our mindset, be more sustainable, more responsible in the way we do IT today, and we do AI today.
Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that what you said is like 100% right, which is that as I said, like you kind of have to actually think through the entire stack for this. And you have to start going after every stack and thinking about how you optimize it. Like I'll give you an instance about cooling. And I know you wanted to talk about cooling.
Yes, air conditioning
Right.
for the data centers,
For the data centers.
and now the liquid cooling that's coming in to try to.
Exactly.
Yes, go ahead.
So over the years, what we've actually done is we have figured out that we don't need liquid cooling for a vast majority of compute. In fact, even today, like pretty much all our data centers run on air cooling. And what it means is we use outside air to actually cool our data centers. None of our data centers are nearly as cool as what you are in this room, by the way, just to be very clear. And
Not as cold as in this room?
not even close.
What's the average temperature in a data center?
It's well above the 80 degrees.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Okay. What's
Right.
the range?
It's between 80 to 85. Now, the thing is that you have to be careful about cooling the data centers too much because you have to worry about relative humidity at that point as well. And so we've spent a lot of time in computational fluid dynamics to look at it to say, do we really need to actually cool the data centers as much? And it's one of the reasons why our data centers run primarily on air and outside air, actually. Now, there is a certain point of time where you cannot do it with just air. That's where liquid cooling comes in. But liquid cooling comes into effect because some of these AI chips have to be cooled at the microscopic level, and air cannot actually get there fast enough. But even there, if you think about it, you only need to liquid cool a particular AI chip. But as I said, AI does not require just the chip. You need network, you need like the storage and all that. Those things are still cooled by air. So my estimate is that like even in a data center that has primarily AI chips, only about 60% to 70% of that needs to be liquid cooled. The rest of it is just pure air cooled.
That's pretty fascinating, I think, because I think that's been discussed more recently that liquid cooling is actually more crucial. I don't know if you saw Elon Musk tweeting a picture of the fans that he has. He like made a pun about how his fans are helping whatever. Anyways, go check it out. It's on X. Thank you to circle back on the cooling. I think that was definitely, I think a big question for energy use because those systems require a lot of energy. As we come to the last couple of minutes, I want to turn the conversation forward-looking. The next 2 to 5 years, if I were to be back here with the four of you sitting on this stage, what would we be talking about? And where are still, do you think, at that point, gaps that we would need to, that we haven't been fulfilled even, since sitting here now? Especially because I think, as you mentioned, right, like infrastructure is not easily upgradable like software is, and there will need to be those investments, physical investments, whether it's labor, whether it's land, physical resources. So in 2 years, what do you think we're going to be talking about in terms of infrastructure on the stage?
I'll start. I think we're already starting to talk about that. So I expect that we'll talk more about those things. There's going to be a lot more innovation. Generative AI will spur that as well in terms of how to think about renewable sources and how to actually run these things very efficiently. Because some of the things that are realities is that generative AI is actually really expensive to run, right? And so you're not going to actually spend a lot of money unless you actually get value out of it. And so there's going to be a lot of innovation on the size of these models. There's going to be a lot of innovation on chips. We're already starting to see that. And there's going to be a lot of innovation on, of course, nuclear will be a part of this of the energy equation. I think the path from here to, at least in our minds, our path to get to net zero carbon by 2040 is going to be very non-linear. It's not going to be this one size fits all. It's going to be extremely non-linear, but I expect that there'll be a lot more efficiency running in it. It's one of the reasons why we harp so much on efficiency, on how we actually run our infrastructure. One, it actually helps us in terms of our costs, which we actually translate to our customers. But also is a very responsible thing for us to do.
David, I actually want to jump over to you just for a second on this because, a lot could happen in the next couple of months when it comes to the administration here in the U.S. Is there anything that you see in the next 2 years politically that could change the direction or the pace of development when it comes to AI infrastructure building, investments from corporations, maybe even pulling back, right? Pressures from investors to see that ROI on the cost of these systems.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to engage in speculation on the political landscape, but I think things like the CHIPS Act, U.S. leadership in AI are things that enjoy bipartisan support, and I think that will continue regardless of the outcome of elections and short-term political considerations. You know, I think getting to your question on what we'll be talking about a few years down the road, I'm an optimist, so I think we'll be talking about how we have a more resilient supply chain for chips around the world. I think we'll be enjoying the benefits of some of the research investments that propel innovation. One additional point I'd like to raise real quickly is soft infrastructure and human talent. I think that's an important challenge, and at least in the US, we have a huge skills gap among the workforce, whether it's K through 12 STEM education or retaining the foreign students at our top universities, and that's not just a semiconductor issue. That's all technology, advanced manufacturing throughout the economy. So I think that will be a continuing challenge.
Are you seeing governments willing and interested to increase funding in those areas?
On a limited basis, but I think we have a lot of work to do.
What do you mean by limited? What do you mean by limited?
I think there's a strong interest in this, but I'm not sure governments are willing to step up and invest in the way we need to as a society.
Sanjay? 2 years. We're talking again. What's going to be on our minds?
So we have not seen what Gen AI will do to us. We are still like in kindergarten talking about infrastructure. It's like the internet boom time, right? And then we know what happened with that. Our whole lives changed. With Gen AI, enterprises will reinvent themselves. Our society will reinvent themselves. And all that will be possible because of a lot of innovation happening in the hardware end as well, software layer as well. What we need to, however, keep in mind as we transform, none of us in this room know how the world will look like. It will look very different. That's what's certain. But one thing that we need to keep in mind is this transformation should be responsible. It should be keeping human in the center of this transformation. We have to keep the environment in the ESG, all three very important, so that our AI does not disenfranchise communities, people. I think that is going to be the biggest innovation challenge for us, because I'm very certain that human ingenuity is such that we will build a better world than what we have today. There'll be a lot of innovations in all spheres, but in the journey, let's make sure that responsible AI becomes the central aspect. Sustainable and responsible AI become a central theme as we go through this journey, right? So yeah. I'm as eagerly looking forward to it as all of us here, how this world will look.
Yeah, no digital hoarding. Lastly, Neil, we didn't talk about the last mile customization problem today, but I don't know if that's something that you're looking for in the next 2 years to be solved. What other things? And you can speak to the last mile too if you want.
Sure. So for those who don't know, the idea of the last mile problem in AI is that you can build, say, a large language model and say this works really well in general for people asking questions on the internet. But that might still not mean that it works really well for your company for some really specific thing. If you're interacting with your own customers, right, on your own products with those specific terms, with those things, that system may not work that well. And you have to do some customization. That customization may be easy. You just need a little prompt engineering, or you feed it a little bit of information from your company, or it could be more substantial. You could actually have to retrain it. And in those cases, that's going to slow the spread of AI, because it's going to mean that we're going to get lots of improvement in one area, but then you say, okay, well, think about all of the different companies that might want to adopt. They have to figure out how they can adapt the systems to work for the things they do, and that's going to take time and effort. And so that last mile is going to be one that I think is going to be really important, because I think it's very easy to say, I read on the newspaper or I saw a demonstration that said, boy, AI can do amazing things, much more than it could do even 3 months ago. And that's absolutely true. But then there's also this diffusion process, and that's going to take a lot longer. And so I think what we should expect over the next 2 years in terms of this is more of this sort of wedge of there are going to be some folks who are leading, and these resource things that we've been talking about are being incredibly salient for them. And they're going to be people who are behind, for whom the economics of customization don't still work, and they're going to be in the model that they were in 10 years ago. And so that divide, I think, is going to get bigger over the next 2 years.
David, thank you for joining us. Sanjay, Neil, Prasad, and for all of you, hopefully you found this as informative as I did. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow CXO Bytes on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we are doing. It helps other people discover the show, and of course, we want more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.